Welcome back, everybody, to Card Art in Sunnyvale, California. We're approaching round number 3, the third and final round of our weekly Modern event. I'm Optimus Tom Sirfosh, joined by Akira. We've seen a whole slew of different decks in the feature match area so far, and the last round, we're going to get 2 more new ones.
Yeah, two new ones. We're gonna see Blue-Black Fairies, a deck that we talked about at the start of the show, and I believe is it Murktide with a twist?
A little bit of a twist. We heard that there are some different creatures slotting in, maybe some different spells. The player Jack just wound up putting Jank down on their
Yeah.
deck name, but we were watching out there to see what kind of deck that they were actually playing, and it is a Murktide deck, but it still is it, and it's got some tweaks. So this is a matchup that I don't have too much experience with because I haven't seen a fairies list since I don't know, when I was still in high school, maybe. So that's a very long time ago. But on paper, how are you thinking that the Murktide deck matches up against the fairies deck, which is historically kind of like a is it mid-range deck versus now a Dimir tempo deck, which kind
Yeah.
of is
So
flopped.
so this matchup is gonna be like super interactive. Like a ton of counter spells gonna get thrown out, bunch of small creatures just trying to like get in and like doing chip damage over a few turns. So it's gonna be a little bit different from the first two rounds.
We'll have to see too how the removal packages kind of line up because the Dimir decks in general have very good creature removal, very efficient creature removal. But then there's also from the Izzet side, you have the burn aspect that the Murktide decks can come from. Also, I'm very interested since this isn't the normal Murktide list, if there are going to be any sort of graveyard shenanigans. I mean, if you do wind up having an Underworld Breach with Lightning Bolts, that deck has more lasting power than kind of like the Dimir deck who just wants to play creatures and attack while kind of controlling the board just through disruption.
Yeah, and a really key part is the Murktide deck would not be able to interact with Bitter Blossom if
Mm.
the Fairy deck managed to land it early, and that could be like a huge swing for fairies here.
This is going to be really fun if we get a Bitter Blossom on the battlefield. I haven't seen that card since I sideboarded it in, so that'll be really cool if we do get to see some Bitter Blossoms getting thrown around. As we are going to be switching on over to the players and jumping into game number 1 in just a second, as we actually see they did just get to starting, so it's already off to a bit of an explosive start. We said this is going to be a little more interactive, but it does look like that these players here are just going to be already playing extremely fast. We have Jack on the Izzet Murktide side. For his turn was already playing, looks like a Dragon Rage Channeler and that Mishra's Bauble to get some Surveil triggers. But on the flip side, we had Jimmy on Dimir Faeries, responding to that, being able to get rid of it, and looking now like a Picklock Prankster, which has been a Pioneer All-Star, also helping find pretty much every creature threat in this deck.
Yes, and also the funny thing about Picklock Prankster is that it can pick up Bitter Blossom because
Oh,
Bitter Blossom
yeah.
is a typo enchantment fairy, and Picklock Prankster can pick up pretty much any fairy.
That's actually really cool. So we are going to see instead going to be getting a Sleep Cursed Fairy, which is something that we might see both players playing this game.
Yeah, I talked to Jack a little bit, and he told me that there might be some Sleep Curse Fairy in place of Ragavan of all things
All
in
right.
his deck.
Well, we see here the Sleep Cursed Fairy. It's a 1-drop, which is a 3/3, flying ward 2, but it enters the battlefield tap with 3 stun counters on it. You have to pay mana to untap it. The stun counter, of course, is going to wind up being if we get untapped, you remove a stun counter from it instead, so you have to kind of pay 6 mana to kind of get it online. But this fairies deck being able to just kind of hold up things at instant speed here, we already see it starting to remove counters.
Yeah, so looked like Jack play a bauble. Uh, Decided to bauble himself and didn't crack the fetch, so probably found something he liked off the top. And this fairy deck, I believe that is a surveil land, another super fairy here. So in a couple of turns, he's just gonna be 3/3 swinging in, and lightning bolt costing 3 mana to kill these fairies is gonna be pretty rough.
Yeah, that'll be a little devastating from the Murktide deck, but we did see the fetch line actually being cracked, so Jack just kind of waiting to see what was going to be played from Jimmy's side before deciding if he wanted to shuffle that card on top away or not. But we still have the 2 mana open from the Dimir Fairies deck that can potentially take another one of those stun counters off the newly played Sleep Curse Fairy, putting that one to 1. The other one is going to be at 0 next turn, but will still be tapped. We could see them, if there's no interaction here or nothing to be interacted with, just taking the counter off and being able to start swinging him for 3 right away.
Yeah, we see an Unholy Heat in the hand, which is also not great against these Ward 2 creatures.
Especially not with Delirium quite online yet. There is an expressive iteration in Jack's hand, though, so that would get sorcery in addition to the artifact landing creature type. So that expressive iteration not only is just a great play right here, but is also probably going to be the key to getting Delirium from Jack's side. However, there's still 2 mana available from Jimmy's side and a fistful of cards, so there's any number of counter magic like Spell Stutter Sprite that could come out for this.
Yeah, and Jack played the island before doing anything, so the expressive iteration wouldn't look that great because the play pattern with expressive iteration is usually you want to find a land, exile it, play it out. So that's how you generate card advantage with it. But just pass it back to Jimmy, and Jimmy get to just take a turn, untap his fairy.
Yep. So he did wind up using that mana to get rid of the second stun counter on the Sleep Curse Fairy that was played last turn. So now both of these fairies potentially can be swinging in for 6 damage on Jimmy's following turn here by just keeping some mana available. Does look like that Picklock Prankster is going to be the play here. So just putting a 1/3 flying wall into play.
Yeah, and this fairy deck just want a critical mass of creature in play. I don't know if Jimmy's on any spell stutter. Not the creature, but like the
The
spell.
actual spell.
Yeah, the actual spell stutter. But both of them care about how many fairies you have in play. So just flooding the board with the creature type and will really enable these cards.
So do you see just that Picklock Prankster, and it looks like a passing of the turn over here?
Jack is just debating what to do here. Have 3 land separate to the side. Uh, Maybe he's trying to see if you want to cast that Unholy Heat on one of the creatures. Here's the expressive iteration that we saw earlier. A counter spell out of Jimmy.
Just good old-fashioned counterspell.
And a counter spell back. Really need that expressive iteration to resolve. And now Delirium's online.
Delirium is there. Still has to pay the ward cost for these Sleep Curse Fairies, unfortunately, but Expressive Iteration finding another Mishra's Bauble, which that's just going to go into exile, puts another card into hand, one on the bottom of the library, and it looks like the card that was put into hand is a Lightning Bolt.
Yes. So does have a little bit of removal for the Sleep Curse Fairy, but the Ward 2 really coming into play here.
We got a Dragon's Rage Channeler coming across, and this Mishra's Bauble was in exile from the Expressive Iteration, so it hasn't actually been played yet.
Fairy Fencing, another card from Wilds of Eldraine, really giving like a resurgence for this fairy archetype.
Yeah.
So this is basically just a 1 mana -3/-3, which is fairly strong, and it can scale up with how much mana you got. So if this is a really great answer to something like a Murktide region later in the game.
And also, very fortunately, killing a Delirium Dragon Rage Channeler there already just for just 1 mana. It did unfortunately mean that Jimmy couldn't take the last stun counter off of the Sleep Curse Fairy, but there's still 4 damage being presented on board with this Picklock Prankster and the other Sleep Curse Fairy that had been kind of getting the counters removed. But we see 2 cards in hand now for the Fairies player. I believe 3 cards in hand for Jack, one of which we know is a Lightning Bolt, and it does look like just a swing for 4 coming across for the Fairies player.
Yeah, and Jimmy here just going to untap the other Sleep Curse Fairy, just coming in for 7 damage. And this is why I really like this new style of fairy where you kind of be the control deck early on in the game while you establish these hard to remove creatures, and then suddenly you become the beatdown, and these fairy can really come in for a lot of damage.
It definitely feels like more of that tempo style that the deck played with kind of like an old extended, where instead of playing 4-mana haymakers like the Champion Fairy. There's a 4/4. Now you're playing just these aggressively cost small creatures, kind of like melding what made the Delver decks good in like Old, Modern, and Legacy, and making it into a fairies list. But now we're going to see big Murktide Regent coming out. We don't need Delirium anymore with none of these Deathray Shaman. I keep saying that. Dragon's Rage Channelers, DRC, not DRS. So delving away a whole mass of spells here,
It's
and
actually not that big. I think there's only 2 instant or sorcery getting exile.
it looked like there were 2 Mishra's Bauble. So yeah, just putting 2 +1/+1 counters on that Murktide Regent. So 5/5, but it still does make it the biggest thing on the battlefield.
Yeah, but now the fairy fencing we saw earlier can just be pointed at the Murktide, and now you can swing in with the Sleep Curse Fairy, force a block out, and the fairy fencing just blow out this Murktide because it couldn't trade with the fairy anymore.
Sure, we do have 4 mana available from the side of Jack, though, so assuming there's some sort of interaction from their side, looks like there is.
I believe that is a counter spell and an
Yeah.
unholy heat.
So we'll see here, because those unholy heats are going to wind up taking 3 mana to kill, although delving away the Delirium means that that's actually going to be able to kill any of these Sleep Curse Fairies.
Yeah, it's only deals 2 damage. You have to pay 3 mana for it. We're gonna see a block here on one of, and a fairy fencing that I was alluding to. Jack debating whether he wants to use this counterspell, but if Jimmy have a counterspell back, this could be a really, really big blowout.
Just verifying that that is the Amonkhet Invocation counterspell that Jack has in their hand. So, just making things super easy to read.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of these Amonkhet Invocation. I don't know about you.
I like Thoughtseize, but, that's just bias from me being a mono black player. But we are going to see 3 mana for Unholy Heat. Did he actually keep Delirium? I saw a land, I saw a Bauble, and a creature. Is there another spell underneath that pile? But it doesn't matter.
It does not matter. Here comes the spell stutter, and so even with that that counter spell, it wouldn't have mattered either with this spell stutter. And Jimmy in a commanding position here with these Sleep Curse Fairies.
So I take 4?
So it looks like just 4 damage coming across from that, I think, because this was after blocks.
One of the fairy was blocked. And Jack is down to 6. And Jimmy just presenting lethal on board with untapped mana.
So we have 6 damage from those Sleep Curse Fairies alone, and then there's just an extra 2 damage coming in from those small creatures, but we're starting out here with an Expressive Iteration. Does find a Murktide, another Unholy Heat, and this Subtlety going to very quickly be going to the bottom. Heat's going to be exiled, Murktide goes to hand. But this is going to be 3 mana to cast that Unholy Heat, which means unless Jack has a land in hand, you can't play that Murktide as well.
So let's see what Jack decides to do here. I would go for the Murktide here. And I think this Murktide can be slightly bigger than the last one. But still not super great.
Looks like Jack is debating that Steam Vents that's in hand right now. That would have to be shocked in down to 4. Getting rid of a Sleep Curse Fairy means that that's 3 additional mana being paid off to cast that Unholy Heat. Then that's going to be 2 mana for a Murktide, which I believe is going to be a 5/5 still, because there's an Expressive Iteration and an Unholy Heat. Well, the second Unholy Heat there, so be a 5/5 unless there's 1 additional spell in the graveyard here from Jack. So that would be able to block a Sleep Curse Fairy, but that also means a counter spell, a removal spell, and Jack's just dead from this play.
Yes. So we do see the Unholy Heat going through here, and yeah, and Jack just pass.
He has a Lightning Bolt that we've known about for a while, but
doesn't quite. It does keep him alive.
And this is only 5 right now.
This is only 5. It is only 5 damage.
So let's see, is Jack going to go down to 1? Or is he going to have to Lightning Bolt a Picklock Prankster?
That just feels really bad. And even then, you would put yourself down to 2. So it the Murktide would be able to block the Sleep Curse Fairy next turn.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so maybe going down to 2 and leaving Jimmy with 1 attacker could be the play. Jimmy also only have 1 card in hand. It
Oh, and
is
it's a counter
a counter
spell.
spell.
So Jack getting a little punished there, but that does mean that Murktide wasn't resolving last turn anyway.
Yeah. So
So that would have been a shock and death.
so maybe baiting out the counter spell and having the Murktide resolve here uh might have been good if Jack had a removal spell.
Yeah, but unfortunately, it looks like that's just going to be all she wrote right there. It's going to be Jimmy taking game number 1 with the Dimir Faeries list. Some very timely counter magic, some very good fairy fencings coming in to kind of just make this matchup a bit lopsided. And we're going to wind up having to go to sideboards to see if the Murktide player has any sort of responses while they're able to be on the play this game.
And so looking at Jimmy's sideboard here, I see some pick your poison. So this is a
Sultai Fairies.
Sultai Fairy, but I don't think it's a true Sultai though.
I think it's the Sultai, like kind of like Izzet Murktide was the Temur Murktide was only playing Pick Your Poison, and then they started playing Questing Druid.
So that's the thing about the modern format right now is if you're a 2-color deck, splashing maybe 1 Surveil land and 1 Shock land to be able to play a really powerful card like pick your poison in your sideboard is and with the rise of the domain deck, maybe it's a necessary thing.
Yeah, because Pick Your Poison, of course, is going to be able to hit not only Leyline of the Guild Pack, you can make them sacrifice their Scion or Draco, so it gets around the Hexproof clause there. You could do it. You can do it to just kind of make their entire board lose its kind of oomph because it just doesn't have all those extra abilities from the Scion or Draco. And then, of course, it has a lot of potential against popular decks like the Espergorios list, getting rid of Bristlebrand, getting rid of Atraxa, getting rid of every kind of big creature that deck is going to want to reanimate is very solid, which is why we see it in so many lists and so many lists splashing to that 3rd color. But from the Murktide side, what do we? First off, I don't think that Jack's going to be anticipating seeing Pick Your Poison from a basically Dimir Faeries list. We didn't see any of the green mana that game either. So what do you think Jack is going to be bringing in here to kind of combat the similar game plan to a Murktide deck?
So, of course, Stern Scolding is a very, very strong card in this type of matchup where a lot of their threats are just 1 mana, 2 mana creatures, and Stern Scolding being able to properly trade with those creatures maybe better than these burns removal spell into something like Sleep Curse Fairy.
Yeah, I was gonna say the Stern Scolding actually, funnily enough, can't deal with the Sleep Curse Fairy, but it can deal with Spell Stutter Sprite. It can deal with Picklock Prankster. It can deal with basically every other fairy from the fairies list. So I still think it does warrant slots coming in over some of these burn spells that, like you said, on the battlefield can't really do a ton. Yes, it does. My Lightning Bolt, I think, may be the one that you keep over something like an Unholy Heat, especially if you are going to be delving away or getting rid of your graveyard more frequently in order to be able to kind of cast these giant Murktides in combat. I wouldn't be surprised to see the Unholy Heats coming out, the Lightning Bolt staying in, and things like Stern Scolding or if there's a Spell Snare or something like that coming out from the sideboard of Jack in its place.
And I've seen, and while he was casting Expressive Iteration, Jack does have some amount of Blood Moon in the main deck. I'm not sure if more additional Blood Moon effects could be coming in. We did see a few basic out of Jimmy, but if Jack can catch Jimmy off guard with his fetches and slam an early Blood Moon, it can really lock Jimmy out this game.
Especially if he's putting in those Pick Your Poisons with a Murktide and then can't actually use green mana, because I'm assuming there's no basic forest from a mostly Dimir Faeries list.
So that could be a way to go for Jack. It looks like Jack is still deciding on his sideboard.
Yeah, I think what we're kind of in agreement with is that Jack is going to be looking to deal with the Fairies deck on the stack, whereas the Murktide deck usually is going to be looking at like Brotherhood's End and stuff like that. Those are cards that could still come out here against Jimmy's deck, but in the confines of this tempo deck, being able to play Spell Stutter Sprite, regular counter spell, and having these interactive removal spells, I think it may wind up being, like we mentioned, a lot of counter magic, especially that Jack is on the play here, being able to start off holding up Stern Scolding or holding up a Spell Snare type effect. That could be very powerful as opposed to trying to burn through the ward cost of these Sleep Curse Fairies.
That is very true. Uh, and you got a point. These brothers and could be coming in, but doesn't feel great against a lot of what the fairy decks want to do.
It feels great against specifically Sleep Curse Fairy. Everything else is kind of like, I'm killing a Spell Stutter Sprite by dealing 3 damage to the board because I have to, kind of deal. But it could be something that we look at doing to get around the ward cost and maybe taking out those Lightning Bolts in its place.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny that both players are on the Sleep Curse Fairy. Uh, when the card first came out, not a lot of people think this would be modern playable, but it it looked like it putting in a lot of work in this matchup.
Yeah, the thing with the Sleep Curse Fairy is too is we're normally used to seeing this accompanied by a combo of some sort, being able to use it to untap itself so that you can continue to get a lot of potential, making mana with it, being able to bounce things off of like a retraction helix or something like that. But up here, just literally being Fairy Ragavan.
Or a Delver of Secret that's
Oh, yeah.
like super hard to kill.
Oh yeah, like this in the Delver of Secrets slot for a list that it's going to be synergizing with its fairy type instead of just needing to be able to flip and being able to play more creatures alongside it. But Jack is going to start out very... Look, there it is! Sleep Curse Fairy of his
Jack has
own!
his own Sleep Curse Fairy.
In addition to a Mishra's Bauble, which is something that I don't think Jimmy is going to be playing. Mishra's Bauble, not kind of where you want to be. Jack's deck does want to have more fuel for the delve effect of the Murktide, in addition to keeping Delirium up for some cards like Unholy Heat or Dragon Rage Channeler. So just kind of getting the tempo on his side very early. And I'm actually was wondering if we are going to see Jack going bigger to the control side with these counter spells and board wipes, or if he was just going to try to straight up duel the tempo of the Fairies deck. And right away, just turn one, keeping this kind of pressure up, it looks like that Jack is going to be firing on all cylinders right from the start.
And here's a Fairy Seer from Jimmy. It's not quite as big as a Sleep Curse Fairy, but the card selection is very good for this tempo style play where you want a mix of both threats and answers. So getting to Scry 2 here is pretty nice.
This is why I like having you here, because I had no idea what that card was on the battlefield right away.
I have the privilege of playing Jimmy a lot, so
okay.
I'm very familiar with this list.
It's just going to be a Steam Vent shocked in, and right away, oh, there's that Dragon's Rage Channeler,
And
DRC.
keeping up the 1 mana could signal Spell Pierce, Stern Scolding. I don't know if the Murktide deck have any 1 mana flash creature. Probably not.
Probably not. I mean, the card that I might be leaning towards that I know they've cut for a while has been Consider. Don't think it's going to be a Consider in this slot here. But just a passing of the turn here from Jimmy with a fetch land available. So just representing the counter spell, which we did see in his hand. Also has a Spell Stutter Sprite on the top there. So just kind of pick of the litter to interact with whatever Jack is going to do. But Jack, of course, could potentially just remove this stun counter and come in swinging.
Yeah. Jack just said pass. So
Ooh, no third land then.
no third land drop. Still could just untap this Sleep Curse Fairy and then come in for 3 damage next turn. Jimmy going for a fetch. Let's see if he... Okay, fetch for a Surveil land.
Yeah, and that's the Dimir Surveil.
Yep, that's under City Sewers, I believe.
So just going to get the Surveil, fix the top of their deck.
So, didn't really like what he saw from the Fairy Seer.
Yeah, I do believe there was a bottom from that scry as well. I know we had the card over the screen, but I think that's what I wound up seeing. So just making sure that the deck has something that something new to draw from Jimmy's side. Knowing that his opponent stumbled on mana, this is where a tempo deck like Dimir Faeries can really shine if there is a play to be had here. We do know it looks like there's another Surveil land that's going to be entering the battlefield this turn. So again, continuing to fix the top of their deck. Jimmy isn't really hard pressed to do anything here because we do know that they have 2 additional counter magic spells in hand, and with the stumble on mana, keeping that up is probably just enough, and we are just going to see a passing of the turn.
Yeah, and Jack have probably just untap the Sleep Curse Fairy and really put Jimmy under some kind of pressure to force out these cards from Jimmy's hand.
Takes the counter off the
Yeah.
Sleep Curse Fairy, so that will untap in the upkeep, or after upkeep. And looks like Jimmy may have something in Jack's upkeep. Now, looks like the players are just communicating and signaling what they're going to do. As we see Jack swinging in for 3. No blocks coming over from Jimmy's side. Just wants to keep that fairy alive to make Spell Stutter a little bit more powerful. But another no land play from Jack. Just the passing of the turn.
Yeah, Jimmy just... So in this position, even though Jack doesn't have any land drops, this Sleep Curse Fairy actually put him ahead a little bit on board and make these counterspell in Jimmy's hand doesn't look that great.
Yeah, this is a different kind of look from the Murktide deck, whereas normally they want to be developing the board and putting mana down every turn and playing multiple spells in addition to interaction. But right here, this is just Jack content with his 2 mana. It looks like a dress down in hand as well. So being able to potentially get rid of a Spell Stutter Sprites enters the battlefield effect, but a Sleep Curse Fairy, you don't want to dress down these Sleep Curse Fairies from Jimmy's side.
You really don't want to, but like double Sleep Curse Fairy for Jimmy here. It's gonna take a few turns for them to get rid of the stun counter, but once they do, they can really start tussling with the other Sleep Curse Fairy here.
Yeah, and it looks like Jimmy had those both in hand, was just waiting for 4 mana to be able to play both of those and have counter magic backup, even though his opponent was stumbling on land. And we see Jack binning a Murktide Regent off of the Surveil trigger from Dragon's Rage Channeler. Really a hard press for land here. Not even a fetch land, so there's still only 2 out of 4 for Delirium. This DRC is not going to be swinging in as a 3/3, which means this clock is just a little bit slower than Jack would have wanted this game.
Yeah, and I think Jimmy was just like playing it this slow so he can like really set up his hand here. Taking the damage from the Sleep Curse Fairy, not in any rush to really do anything here, because like you said, Jack just misses like several land drops in a row now.
So a draw with a bobble here for Jack. Jimmy takes a counter off of one of those Sleep Curse Fairies before he untaps for his turn. And it looks like a Fatal Push from the side of Jimmy as well. So if Jimmy has another land drop, you could wind up playing ward cost and keeping up counter magic for this Fatal Push.
Yeah, this is gonna be a very powerful turn for Jimmy here. Might wind up just Fatal Pushing this DRC to stop Jack from digging toward his land drop, and because in the future these Sleep Curse Fairy is gonna be able to trade with Jack's Sleep Curse Fairy anyways.
And it does look like that Jack deciding that DRC not worth saving or potentially doesn't have anything to save it with. So Fatal Push is just going to wind up taking that one down, leaving just a Sleep Curse Fairy on Jack's side. We do know that Jack has a dress down in hand, but we don't know if there's any lightning bolts or anything to try to keep this clock up. And no, just a passing of the turn from Jimmy, and Jack goes to untap.
I would have cycled the dress down there, just to like dig a little bit deeper. And if you draw a Sleep Curse Fairy, maybe you can play it without any downside.
I think Jack is just very keen that Jimmy's been keeping up 2 mana and playing these Sleep Curse Fairies very slowly. So knowing that there's a counterspell in hand, Dress Down wasn't ever going to cycle at that point. However, finding the land, if it does resolve on a board where it doesn't do anything, could have been a potential play here. But Jack is finally going to find land number 3, shocks in another Steam Vent, and it looks like Jimmy's going to be playing blocking duty here. Doesn't really need that fairy anymore to kind of keep up the fairy count. And another fairy getting flashed in here. This is a Brazen Borrower.
Just playing it as a creature here, gotta be met with a Stern Scolding.
So we did wind up seeing Stern Stolding coming in. So Brazen Borrower, the hidden text on Brazen Borrower, which is normally just bounce something, the hidden text of a 3/1 flying blocker that can only block flying creatures.
I mean, in this matchup, that's all you need, right?
Yep.
Here come
Unlicensed
Unlicensed
Hearse. This is going to be something that Jack may want to deal with. There's a Spell Snare, so
Yep.
already seeing a lot of counter magic that we were talking about from Jack's sideboard. This Unlicensed Hearse represents not only keeping Delirium under check, but making Murktide Regent very sad.
Very uncastable. And Jimmy is gonna want that Unlicensed Hearse to resolve. And we're gonna see a Spell Stutter coming out. Be met with a Spell Pierce onto the Unlicensed Hearse.
So Spell Pierce, Stern Scolding, and Spell Snare all coming out from what looks like the sideboard of Jack. Maybe Spell Pierce having 1 or 2 copies in the main deck, or the Stern Scolding having 1 or 2 copies. But a good old-fashioned counter war. And Jack, now we know why Jack was content to keep that 2-land hand. It had so much interaction. He was waiting for Jimmy to feel comfortable to start deploying threats on their own. And it looks like now the Spell Stutter Sprite's just going to be playing blocking duty. But the downside is these Sleep Cursed Fairies from Jimmy's side are going to be able to untap next turn. And Jack is not going to be able to just start pecking away at creatures anymore.
That is true. And the... Oh, I don't know what is in Jack's hand that can really deal with these Sleep Cursed Fairy.
Go to my end step after end step.
It looks like after on end step,
So
Jack
on
wants to
end
do
step.
something.
Yeah, during end step. Yeah, that's what I
Yeah.
meant. Attempt to dress down.
So during Jack end step, he wants to dress down to keep the dress down until Jimmy end step.
So then Jimmy won't be able to actually activate to untap the other Sleep Curse Fairy. So there's only going to be 3 potential damage coming across.
Yeah, and I see a lightning bolt in. Oh, so Jack dressed
rid of
down to
ward.
turn off the ward cost to kill the Sleep Curse Fairy. What a play!
That's pretty heads up there from Jack. So Dress Down resolves. Worst case scenario, he's only facing 3 damage next turn. Best case scenario, he basically stuffs Jimmy's board entirely.
And now Jack, having the Sleep Curse Fairy without the counter, can really start going to town here.
Yep. Now, the best thing here for Jimmy to have is a fairy fencing to get rid of the opposing Sleep Curse Fairy.
I think that stun counter was okay. It's the dress down doesn't turn off the stun counter ability, so Jimmy just won't be able to use the Sleep Curse Fairy ability.
Yeah, the stun counters themselves will get removed, but the ability to untap, which on Sleep Curse Fairy removes a stun counter, is not there. So still going to be able to remove the stun counter, so it will untap next turn. So if Jack has anything to do here, like play another Sleep Curse Fairy, he's got to do it now.
No. The dress down got removed from on Jimmy Ensep, so this Sleep Curse Fairy will enter with a counter, with the stun counter, but I think it's got met with a counter spell. So it's just attacking with the Sleep Curse Fairy. Jimmy takes 3, doesn't want to untap his Sleep Curse Fairy and block.
You see Jimmy just slamming a land, swinging in for 3 and passing the turn. That signals that last card in hand, he could be looking at a fairy fencing, but Dragon's Rage Channeler, that should have Delirium this game.
Counterspell on the Dragon's Rage Channeler was the last card in Jimmy's hand. And I believe there's a Murktide region in Jack's hand. So untap and block here.
So a clear board, no cards in hand from Jimmy, and this looks like it's going to be just a preordain.
Just setting up for this Murktide. Fairly big Murktide coming down here now that Jimmy is empty board and empty handed.
And it looks like keeping Counterspell on top and drawing it to try to answer whatever Jimmy's going to play this turn. And now next turn gets to also play the Murktide in hand and keep up Counterspell.
Yep.
There we go. This is going to be a decently sized Murktide. I believe we might wind up seeing a 7/7? 8/8.
I think it's an 8/8, yes. And that is lethal on board. And I don't know if Jimmy's deck have any... Oh! That's a Brazen Borrower was drawn for turn.
There's a Brazen Bar, but there's also Counterspell, Spell Pierce in Jack's hand. He
Yeah.
kept both on top from that preordained.
So just gonna have to try, and it's gonna get met with a counterspell, and this is the game.
Yeah, so Jack's going to even things up here at 1 apiece. That was a very interactive game, and like we said, Jack on the play, bringing in a ton of counter magic, really working out for the Murktide deck, and being able to basically out-tempo the Fairies deck, who at first looked like that they were ahead because of all the lands they were drawing, but then just kind of wound up flooding out.
Yeah, and that Sleep Curse Fairy that Jack played on turn 1 really put in a lot of work.
Yeah.
Put Jimmy under a ton of pressure, and then forced out some like really unoptimal blocks with the 1/1 fairies, like the smaller ones, and yeah, it just got him there.
Yeah, that Sleep Curse Fairy basically turned into the Abyss at some point, where it's just removing a creature from Jimmy's side every single turn. And Jimmy played that matchup about as heads up as he could. We saw him waiting until turn 4 with 4 mana to deploy double Sleep Curse Fairy, holding up Counterspell, holding up Spell Stutter Sprite. Jack missing land drops, not finding his third land until his own turn 5, but because of the efficiency of the converted mana cost from Jack's counter magic, it was able to deal with the more threatening counter magic from Jimmy, where it's either a fairy 1/1 body that comes in and can counter big things if mana's available, or it's just a hard counter spell. These 1 mana interactive counter spells were just way too well positioned, even though Jack was behind on mana because he was on the play.
Yeah, so I think we're gonna see a lot more of the same coming out in game 3. But now Jimmy get to go first.
Yeah, and I don't think I really saw any heavy sideboarding from either player, so I don't know if Jimmy is adjusting his plan at all, and I don't know if Jack is kind of changing things up because he's on the draw. We do still see an Unholy Heat in Jack's opening hand here, so I'm not sure what came out for all that counter magic we saw in game number 2, but it wasn't at the cost of just the hard removal.
Yeah, maybe Jack just like taking out some more niche card, like some baubles, or maybe some dress down, cutting those down a little bit. Yes, that is a Secluded Glen from Jimmy.
I love this card. I love this cycle of cards where you just reveal a creature and it comes into play untapped, but holding up just an untapped mana and passing and not actually playing like a Sleep Curse Fairy you would reveal off of this.
So that could signal something like a Stern Scolding for a potentially DRC or Ragavan. We know that Jack doesn't have Ragavan, but Jimmy doesn't know that. So could be holding up a Stern Scolding here.
And it looks like it's just the classic DRC Mishra's Bobble turn from Jack, but now that he's fetched shocked, he's kind of debating what he wants to do, but is just going to go for the DRC, and that's okay. Oh, it's a fatal push in Jimmy's hand. Push. Yeah.
So that would deal with this DRC as well.
Looks like he is going to do it. I don't know if Jack surveilled there, if that was in response to the surveil. But looks like Jack didn't surveil.
I think he did. He surveilled a land to the top of his deck.
Okay.
Oh, and that's Bitter Blossom.
There it is. All right.
One of my favorite card of all time.
If it's your favorite card, I'll let you pick the art as we talk about this. This is going to be a very solid card from the Fairies deck, and something, like you said, the Murktide player is going to have an extremely hard time dealing with.
Yeah, so this represents 9 infinite blockers for this Murktide region. And yeah, so just making a fairy off of the Bitter Blossom and passing the turn here.
Ooh, so that is no land for Jimmy, but we do know that there's a lot of things he could do. There's that face-up Brazen Borrower, so the Petty Theft is going to be something for 2 mana that can happen. The downside of Brazen Borrower is it has to be an opponent's thing, so if this Bitter Blossom sticks around and Jack's able to abyss away these fairies, at some point the Bitter Blossom will become a liability, but from Jimmy's side, he's hoping with Sleep Curse Fairies and these like Brazen Borrowers, if he keeps hitting these land drops, will just be enough to take down Jack.
And we see a Unholy Heat, a Dress Down, and a Counter Spell. So Jimmy being able to Fatal Push that DRC and untap and play this Bitter Blossom kind of put him a little bit ahead on tempo. But
there's another one.
There's another DRC, And if Jack can turn on Delirium, this DRC just become kind of a stonewall for this these fairies.
And Delirium will be hit here if Jack has to counterspell whatever Jimmy is responding with here. So that will be an instant in the graveyard as well, making this a 3/3 Dragon's Rage Channeler. That will have to attack every turn and will be met with a fairy chump blocker, but still, that's where the abyss begins.
Yeah, that can really start draining on Jimmy's life total.
I think you played the island. You fetched this last turn and then you played the island.
Yeah.
Oh, just players just working out like if Jack play a land drop this turn.
Ooh, Spell Stutter Sprite being the card. This could just be met with Dress Down.
Yeah, so don't even need to spend a counter spell here. Dress Down will come out and just shut down this spell stutter sprite.
It's ETB,
I'm
right?
trying to counter this. You can't.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah, as I said, there
Yeah.
should
So-
not have been a surveil
Yeah,
there
this is not
whatsoever.
something else, so because DRC is on the stack.
This will resolve. This will not counter it.
Yeah.
You'll draw a card.
Yes. Sorry.
So players just shuffling to make sure that Jack's deck is sufficiently randomized. There were, besides fetches played, there was the bobble trigger that kept a card on top. That was the land that Jack played last turn. So there's no cards on the bottom of Jack's library or anything that he knows the order of. So just a quick shuffle to make sure that doesn't happen. So there's a draw from the Dress Down instead.
And everything I'll resolve here. Spell stutter sprite hit the field, no ability.
Just a 1/1, and there's
Just
no
a-
surveil from the DRC because it wasn't actually in the battlefield while casting this Dress Down.
And
Untap. So lose one.
Dress Down going to be sacrificed at the end of Jack's turn. And on Jimmy's turn, he get another fairy. Go to 18.
But does he get a third land?
That is... So just tacking in with the 2/1/1s.
Is that 3/3?
Yeah.
This is a 3/3.
It is
yeah.
a 3/3,
So
yeah.
Jimmy not recognizing that Dress Down was the actually fourth card for Delirium, but does have a Fatal Push to deal with it.
And Jack was tapped out from last turn, so the Fatal Push will go through. And
Sure.
really digging for the land drop. What we were draw this turn. Saw the land and kept it on
Saw the
top.
land, just immediately keeps that on top and scries the other one away. So now Jack untaps, facing down 4 creatures all of a sudden out of nowhere, and no creatures in his hand or on his board.
Yeah, it's just 4/1/1s. Just gonna pack him down a little bit here.
This is just good old-fashioned Magic as Richard Garfield, PhD, intended.
Yeah, none of these combos, no twiddling around, just good old Magic.
Yep, just a bunch of 1/1s beating you down, draining your own life a little bit, but we know Jack's hand has a lot of interaction in it. There was definitely an Unholy Heat in the hand. I believe there was another, I forget if it was Spell Pierce or another counter spell in there. So he has traction for things that Jimmy is going to play. The downside is, though, is this Unholy Heat just feels really bad to have to cast against a 1/1.
Yeah, it just doesn't trade very profitably against, especially against this Bitter Blossom. You pointed at a 1/1 that already got the value out of an ETB trigger, so what if it dies? It doesn't really accomplish much.
Basically, every creature on Jimmy's board is expendable right now, and everything Jack has in his hand is something to deal with a critical creature. Which this
Yeah.
Fairies deck, the way that it's constructed and has been constructed historically, has basically been the power is in the swarm of fairies versus a very powerful fairy. But Brotherhood's End did come in from the sideboard.
And that is a blowout. But this Bitter Blossom, like, it's gonna let Jimmy rebuild fairly quickly, unless Jack can start putting threats on board, which I see that is a Murktide in his hand, but facing 3 untapped mana, I don't know if the Murktide resolve.
Did see that Jimmy has a land on top of his library. It looked like another Surveil land there. Now Jack will have to decide, is he going to deploy this Murktide into 3 open mana? We do know that there's 3 cards in hand. That Brazen Borrower was revealed from the Secluded Glen turn 1, and then 2 potential cards represented here by Jimmy. But it is just going to be a passing of the turn. There is a draw off of the Mistress Bauble delayed trigger from Jack's side, which is why he's drawing a card here. And now, Fairy Beatdown.
Once again, just 1/1 beats. just continuing pecking down Jack's life total until he decided to deploy a threat against this Bitter Blossom.
Land, pass.
Yeah, so now that Jimmy have enough land, just availing a land away, don't really want to flood out like last game.
No, but good top deck here from Jack. Just another DRC, and Jimmy might be tempted to fight this one on the stack as it is a Delirium enabled DRC. The Scries will be something that will happen, but it looks like that Jimmy's just going to let that resolve. As I hear Jack saying just passing the turn.
So debating whether to flash in this. So trying to bounce this DRC.
Yeah, because we do know that that was not on an adventure. That was a hand. It was revealed from hand because of the secluded Glen, so that was still able to be petty thefted. But just a spell pierce meeting that one, and no mana to pay for it.
Yes, and this Swarm of Fairy going to be met with a 3/3 blocker. Not going to accomplish a whole lot here. And yep, just confirming to Jimmy that Delirium is in fact online.
So this is an interesting spot here. Who do you think wins this race? Right now, Jimmy is going to be. Oh well, there's a fairy fencing. So
there's a fairy fencing.
So it wasn't going to matter, as I say, because you could attack for 2 this turn. 1 gets blocked, and then 1 damage goes through. But that DRC has to attack every turn. So then it would basically be being met with a chump blocker, and you're dealing 1 damage back every single turn, and you're technically up on life, so your Bitter Blossom is going to kill you.
Yeah, that would have been an interesting back and forth, but a fairy fencing just kind of snuffed it out. And here comes the Murktide.
Looks like an 8/8 Murktide if you want to get rid of all of the instants and sorceries. Oh, sorry, a 6/6 Murktide if you want to get rid of the instants and sorceries. But I think Jack is also keen on keeping Delirium for that Unholy Heat that he has in hand.
Yeah, and once again, the Unholy Heat against these fairy tokens just doesn't feel good.
Not great.
And Murktide gonna get met with counterspell.
So Jack gonna counterspell back.
And Murktide will resolve. Just a 5/5.
Just a 5/5.
Still quite big enough to block these fairy token. But now with 3 fairies, 2 will go through. And petty theft.
Oh, another Brazen Borrower.
Petty theft. Jimmy just playing the tempo game to perfection here.
I mean, top of his deck playing the tempo game to perfection as well. There's been no card draw spells cast by Jimmy's deck, and just being able to find that Brazen Borrower was the perfect answer to Murktide, because now this Murktide is also only going to be a 4/4 if it resolves.
Yeah.
Which looks like it will, because Jimmy's tapped out, and I don't believe Jimmy has any cards in hand. But there's an Unholy Heat finally going to be trading up in damage against this Brazen Borrower. But now, what does Jack do? Looks like he does have Lightning Bolt in hand, which can deal with a fairy. But like we said, trading Burn Spell for fairies, not great. Murktide still will be the biggest thing on the battlefield, but Jimmy's winning this race hands down.
So I think we're going to see a 5/5 Murktide once again.
6/6 Brotherhood's End, the Unholy Heat, and I guess 1 additional spell. Oh, the Spell Pierce.
The Spell Pierce from earlier. Okay, now it's this. So once again, we look at this race that is 3 damage per turn for Jimmy. That's a 3-turn clock, and this Murktide is just gonna get chump blocked by the Bitter Blossom token.
I don't even think the Murktide can attack.
Yeah, the Murktide might just have to be on blocking duty.
Because this is just going to be 3 damage every single turn from Jimmy, just by forcing this Murktide to stay back on chump block duty. He's only taking 1, so that's a 3-turn clock against Jack, and he's only going to be at 9 at the end of that clock. Actually, he'd be at 10 because he wouldn't even need to take another turn.
Yeah, and is a Lightning Bolt. Oh, Fairy Fencing. And this is why our Fairy Fencing get really good, where you can upscale it with mana, but get met with a Lightning Bolt. So yeah, the Murktide will survive. Maybe Jimmy should have just used all his mana, but I guess keeping 2 mana up to play around Spell Pierce.
Something like that, I suppose. But ooh, the Murktide's going on attacking duty, so this is a 6/6. This is technically a 2-turn clock.
Yeah, but it just get met with chump block.
There you go. So, Bitter Blossom token enters the Abyss. And so this is a 2-turn clock now for Jimmy as well, with these 3 power of creatures coming out. Is that another Murktide in
I
hand?
believe that is a Stern Scolding and a
Oh,
Spell
okay.
Snare. And neither of them answer this Sleep Curse.
Neither does a Flooded Strand, so Jack scoops him up. Jimmy is going to take the match 2-1. Dimir Faeries, the tempo game plan, coming out bigger than any Murktide could possibly be.
Yeah, and the top of his deck was very kind to him, like you said. That very timely Brazen Borrower, bounce the Murktide, getting the fairy tokens in.
So that was just another great play there from the Dimir Faeries deck, being able to come in and tempo things out a little bit. We were excited to see that deck on camera. We were also interested how it would kind of interact against Murktide, when Murktide has historically been more of the mid-range style of deck. And even though we saw Murktide kind of becoming the control deck in that matchup, putting in all that counter magic, putting in the Brotherhood's end, like you called that right at the beginning. Bitter Blossom is something the Murktide deck can't answer, and it won the game there.
Yeah, that turn 2 Bitter Blossom after tapping out Jack, and it just run away with the game.
Yeah, so Bitter Blossom was the hero of that one. You know, you haven't been transported back to 2016, or maybe even all the way back to like 2010 extended or something, or I guess maybe it was like 2009 extended or something. I don't even remember when extended ended, but you haven't been transported back in time. Dimir Faeries actually did take the matchup there against Izzet Murktide, and it is just going to wind up being off the back of some very strong tempo play. That is a 2-1 record for the Dimir Faeries player. We were watching a matchup where both players are 1-1 instead of watching the 2-0 match, because every single week when we wind up playing Modern here, during the course of the normal 3-round week, we like to try to just showcase a certain number of decks, all the different types of decks in the room, more so than necessarily the top tables. Whereas at the end of every single month, we have a 4-round event, which is a little bit more competitive. A lot more people coming out for that. When we had 21 for the end of the month Pioneer Tournament on Tuesday, and that's where we usually wind up seeing just the X and O list all the way through, because in that one, there's bigger prize pool, a lot of more things matter. But here, we're just showcasing as many decks as we can before Modern Horizons 3 changes everything.